Shamiya Ny'Air Allen was just 18 years old. She had her whole life ahead of her, dreams, ambitions, and a young son to care for. She was the kind of person who made everyone around her smile, full of life and hope for a future that felt full of possibility. But in a single moment, everything she had hoped for was ripped away. It was a night that should have been like any other, but it wasn't. Shamiya walked into a room that would change everything. Her boyfriend, Brian Jackson Tats, lying in bed with another woman. A woman who wasn't her. A woman who had no place in her world. The shock hit her like a punch to the gut. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breath caught in her throat. All the trust she had built, all the love she had given, crumbled in an instant. In that moment, the reality of her relationship with Brian came crashing down. It was never what it seemed. What she had thought was love was nothing more than manipulation, control, and betrayal. That night, Shamiya's world shattered, and the consequences would be far worse than she could have ever imagined. What would this discovery mean for her? How would this unravel the life she thought she was building? What choice would she make in a moment of desperation and heartbreak? The tragic truth is that the pain of that betrayal would lead Shamiya to a devastating fate. What happened that night? Was it a moment of desperation from a young woman pushed to the edge, or was there something more? Was Shamiya's life truly her own, or had she been trapped in a cycle of abuse that no one saw? As the questions linger, one thing becomes undeniable. Shamiya Allen's story is one of love, manipulation, and a life stolen too soon. This is not just the story of a young woman's heartbreak, it's a story of control, the kind that no one talks about, and the tragic consequences that no one ever expects. Stay with us because what happened next will leave you questioning everything you know about love and the dangers of manipulation. Before we dive deeper into this heartbreaking story, I want to take a moment to stress why it's so important to share Shamiya's story. This isn't just about one young woman's tragic fate. It's about recognizing the signs of manipulation and emotional abuse that many people, especially young women, face in relationships. We need to talk about these issues, break the silence, and raise awareness. As you watch this documentary unfold, I encourage you to reflect on what you're seeing. Do you think Shamiya's death could have been prevented? What could have been done differently to help her before it was too late? I want to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let's get the conversation started. Your voice matters, and together we can help others understand the importance of emotional awareness and protecting themselves from toxic relationships. Now let's dig into Shamiya's story. Before the world stole her chance at happiness, Shamiya Allen was a bright and hopeful young woman. Born in Seaford, Delaware, she grew up surrounded by the love of her family, a community that encouraged her to dream big. Though life in her small town was quiet, Shamiya's spirit was anything but. She had big dreams, dreams of becoming something more, something beyond the borders of the life she knew. From a young age, she was known for her laughter, her energy, and a smile that could light up any room. Shamiya was the kind of girl who believed in the goodness of the world, a girl who thought that love was something pure and beautiful. She was still figuring out what she wanted from life, but one thing was clear. She didn't want to be confined by the limitations of her small world. She had hopes of one day becoming someone important, someone who could make a real difference, who could have a future filled with opportunity and joy. But, like so many young women, she didn't fully understand the dangers that could lurk just beneath the surface of the relationships she formed. Shamiya's family was a cornerstone in her life. Her mother, a strong and loving woman, instilled in her a sense of responsibility and care. Her younger years were filled with support from those closest to her, parents who pushed her to strive for the best, and a close-knit circle of friends who always had her back. Yet, as much as she loved her family and felt a sense of security with them, she also craved something more, something outside of their protective bubble. And then, at the age of 16, Shamiya met Brian Jackson. He was everything Shamiya thought she wanted at the time. Brian, 15 years her senior, exuded confidence in a way that was intoxicating. He was a tattoo artist, worldly, experienced, and full of the kind of charm that made a young girl like Shamiya believe she was special. Brian had that aura of maturity, that ability to make her feel seen, like she was the center of his universe. He had a way with words, carefully chosen, deliberate words that made Shamiya feel grown up, wanted, and desired. From the moment they met, Shamiya was drawn to him. He was different from the boys she went to school with, older, more sophisticated, and seemingly in control of his own life. He made her feel special in ways that no one else had. He gave her the attention she craved and, for a while, made her believe in the kind of fairy tale romance she had always dreamed of. In his presence she felt alive. He made her feel like she could take on the world. Brian, with his tattoos and rough exterior, knew exactly how to speak to Shamiya's insecurities. He made her feel important. He introduced her to a world that seemed exciting, full of promise, one that would take her far beyond the small town she had known. For the first time, she felt like she had a place where she belonged, a relationship that was just for her. In his eyes, she saw a future. But what she couldn't yet see was how this relationship would slowly take everything away from her. In the beginning, Shamiya's innocence was still intact. She believed that love, as she had always imagined it, was finally within her grasp. Brian was everything she thought she wanted, and she entered the relationship with hope in her heart. She wanted to believe it was real, that he cared for her, that she was finally worthy of the love she had dreamed of. But little did she know, she was stepping into something much darker than she could have ever anticipated, a web of manipulation, control, and emotional turmoil that would change her forever. In those early days, Shamiya's heart was full of the hope that only a young girl could have. She trusted Brian completely, believing he would be the one to help her chase her dreams. But the path that lay ahead was one she never could have prepared for, one that would unravel her innocence and destroy the future she had hoped for. Polyamory, at its core, is the practice or desire of having intimate relationships with multiple partners, with the consent and knowledge of everyone involved. While it can be fulfilling for some, it requires a delicate balance of communication, trust, and respect. For Brian Jackson Tatz, polyamory wasn't just a lifestyle, it was a justification for his actions, a way to control and manipulate those around him. He used the idea of multiple relationships to create a facade of freedom and choice, but in reality, it was all about power. Brian introduced Shamiya to polyamory soon after their relationship began. At first, it seemed like a harmless idea, one that made her feel unique and mature. Brian wasn't like the other men she had encountered. He was older, experienced, and offered a world full of possibilities. He told her that love didn't have to be confined to just one person, that it was okay to have multiple connections. To a 16-year-old girl who was still figuring out what love even meant, this idea was tempting, even liberating. Brian framed it as a progressive, enlightened way to love. Love isn't limited, he would say, it's not about ownership, it's about freedom. At first, Shamiya accepted Brian's version of polyamory with open arms. The idea that love wasn't constrained by traditional boundaries seemed like an exciting prospect, especially coming from someone who made her feel seen and desired. In her youthful innocence, she justified his multiple relationships as just another part of who Brian was. She told herself that as long as he made her feel special, that's all that mattered. She thought she could handle it, that she could share him, because in her mind, their connection was unique, and that would always keep them close. But soon the cracks began to show. What seemed like a carefree, open relationship quickly started to feel suffocating. Brian's words didn't match his actions. Though he made her believe in the concept of freedom, he never let Shamiya feel free. He juggled several other women, and Shamiya, despite what she told herself, couldn't ignore the jealousy that began to build inside her. The late-night phone calls, the secrecy, the constant reassurance that everything would be fine, it didn't feel like love. It felt like a game, and she was constantly fighting for a place in his world that seemed to have no space for her alone. As the months went by, Shamiya began to feel emotionally drained. The excitement of a polyamorous lifestyle turned into emotional exhaustion. It wasn't just about sharing Brian anymore, it was about competing for his attention, trying to hold on to a love that was never hers alone. While Brian presented polyamory as a way to share love freely, he didn't seem to understand or care that Shamiya wanted to be loved as an individual, not as just one of many. The more she fought to keep him close, the more distant he became. Brian's multiple partners became an increasing source of tension. Shamiya had never felt more isolated. She felt like she was trapped in a cycle, constantly questioning her worth, wondering if she was good enough for Brian, if he could ever truly choose her. With every new woman who entered Brian's life, her self-esteem plummeted. The more she tried to prove herself, the more she found herself at odds with the reality of her situation. Polyamory was supposed to be a way to build connections, but instead, it left her feeling alone, confused, and unimportant. The emotional toll of living in this polyamorous dynamic began to break Shamiya down. She had no control over her own life anymore. What started as a hopeful, open relationship turned into an emotional battlefield where she fought for scraps of affection. She became consumed by jealousy, jealous of the other women who seemed to have a part of Brian that she couldn't access, jealous of the time he spent with them, and worst of all, jealous of the person she was becoming. The more she compared herself to Brian's other partners, the more she began to doubt her own worth. She was no longer the carefree, confident young woman she had been when they first met. Instead, she was someone who constantly needed reassurance, who felt like she was losing herself in a relationship built on shifting, unstable ground. It became clear that what she had believed was freedom was, in fact, manipulation. Brian's power over her grew, and her feelings of isolation deepened. She wasn't free. She was trapped in a web of emotional control that Brian expertly wove around her. The polyamory wasn't about love, it was about keeping her exactly where he wanted her. Fighting for his attention, constantly seeking approval, and never feeling truly secure. As Shamiya's world grew smaller, her jealousy and emotional distress reached a breaking point. The more Brian's other relationships flourished, the more she withdrew into herself. The facade of a carefree, open relationship slowly cracked. Shamiya found herself spiraling, unable to hold onto the dream of a perfect, inclusive love that she had clung to at the beginning. She had become a prisoner to her own emotions, locked in a cycle of self-doubt and heartache, and Brian, the man who promised her freedom, had become the one who held all the power. The slow unraveling of Shamiya and Brian's relationship began subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. Early on, Brian's affection seemed endless, but as time passed, his emotional distance became undeniable. The first sign of trouble was when Brian began pulling away, leaving Shamiya to wonder what had changed. Small arguments started to creep in, disagreements that once would have been resolved easily but now seemed to fester, leaving Shamiya feeling unheard and invisible. Brian's manipulations were subtle at first. He would shower her with affection after an argument, only to withdraw again, leaving Shamiya desperate for more. His gaslighting tactics made her question her own feelings, her own instincts. When she expressed concern, he dismissed it. "You're overthinking things, babe," he'd say, convincing her that her doubts were irrational. As Shamiya became more emotionally invested, her world became more chaotic. Brian's polyamorous lifestyle, once an exciting prospect, began to feel suffocating. Shamiya found herself caught in a constant battle for his attention, competing with other women who seemed to hold a permanent place in his life. The jealousy started small, almost like a quiet whisper in the back of her mind. But soon it grew louder, consuming her every thought. Every time Brian's phone buzzed, her heart would race. Every time he mentioned another woman, her stomach would churn. Shamiya felt isolated, cut off from her family, from her friends, and even from herself. Brian had manipulated her into believing that she didn't need anyone else, that no one could understand their special connection. But the more isolated she became, the more she began to question her own worth. Was she enough for him? Or was she just another piece in his world of chaos? The tipping point came one night when Shamiya saw Brian with another woman. The jealousy that had been simmering for so long exploded. She had lost herself completely in the fight for his love, and now, standing on the precipice of losing him, she felt empty and broken. It was late in the evening when Shamiya decided to pay Brian a visit. The tension between them had been building for days, small fights over nothing, moments of silence stretching between them like an ever-widening gap. She told herself it was just a rough patch, that they could talk things through and fix it. She walked through the door of his apartment, trying to push aside the unease gnawing at her stomach. She didn't expect what she was about to find. Shamiya stepped into the living room, the silence wrapping around her like a cloak. The apartment was dimly lit, shadows stretching across the walls, creating an eerie calm. Her heart raced as if the universe itself was warning her. She didn't know why, but she had to check on him tonight. She made her way toward the bedroom, the familiar rhythm of her footsteps now disrupted by a sense of dread. And then she saw it. The door was slightly ajar. From the small crack, she could just make out the bed. Her bed, the one she had shared with Brian countless times. As she pushed the door open, her breath caught in her throat. There, in plain view, was Brian. In bed with another woman. Their bodies tangled together under the sheets, the woman's face pressed close to his as they slept, unaware of the storm that was about to hit. The world around her seemed to blur. At first, Shamiya stood frozen, her mind unable to process what she was seeing. No, this can't be real, she thought. But it was real. Her chest tightened, her heart sinking into her stomach as the wave of betrayal crashed over her. She couldn't move. She couldn't speak. All she could do was stare, as if this might somehow make sense if she kept looking. But it didn't. Nothing made sense anymore. When Brian finally stirred, his eyes widened in panic. "Shamiya, wait," he began, but his words were cut off as the flood of anger and hurt exploded inside her. "What the hell is this?" Her voice was sharp, trembling with rage. "What the hell is this, Brian?" The woman in his bed scrambled, embarrassed, as Brian fumbled to cover himself. But it was too late, the damage was done. Shamiya's heart shattered as she stood there, feeling the weight of his betrayal pressing down on her. She felt exposed, vulnerable, like every ounce of trust she had given him had been torn apart in an instant. Brian scrambled for an explanation, but his words were hollow. He tried to assure her that it wasn't what she thought. It's just casual, he stammered. You know how I am, Shamiya. You've seen this before. But Shamiya couldn't breathe. The more he spoke, the more his words twisted the knife deeper. She wanted to scream, to lash out, but all she could feel was the gut-wrenching realization that this wasn't love. It never had been. The man she had poured her heart into, who had promised her a future, who had made her believe she was the one, had used her. And for what? For this? Another woman in his bed? The jealousy, the anger, the betrayal, every emotion collided in a painful rush. She couldn't stay. She couldn't be in this room, in this relationship anymore. But even as she turned away, the realization that this moment marked the end of everything hit her like a punch to the gut. She had loved him. She had trusted him. And in that moment, Shamiya understood that the love she had fought for was a lie. The emotional devastation was overwhelming. She felt like she had been living in a fantasy, a beautiful dream that had shattered in the cruelest way. And as she walked out of the room, leaving Brian and his other woman behind, it was clear. Their relationship was beyond repair. This was the beginning of the end. January 29, 2025, began like any other day for Shamiya Allen, but by the end of the night, her life would be tragically cut short, leaving behind a trail of questions and heartache. The tension between her and Brian Jackson had reached a breaking point. Weeks of emotional strain, jealousy, and manipulation had pushed her to the edge. Despite the pain, Shamiya couldn't seem to walk away from the man she thought she loved. But that night, everything would unravel. Shamiya had been feeling the weight of her relationship for some time. The emotional abuse, the isolation, and the constant competition with Brian's other partners had taken its toll. She tried to suppress the jealousy, tried to tell herself that she could handle it, but inside, the turmoil was growing. It was a feeling of desperation, feeling like she was losing him, like she was being pushed further away with each passing day. And that night, she couldn't take it any longer. It started with a confrontation. Shamiya, fueled by frustration and betrayal, went to Brian's house. She was determined to confront him, to demand answers once and for all. As she stood at his door, her heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of anger and hurt building up inside her. She needed closure, or at least some semblance of it. What happened after that is still shrouded in mystery. Brian's 911 call painted a picture of a woman out of control, desperate and armed. According to Brian, Shamiya had broken into his house, carrying a gun, threatening him. His voice was frantic, yet there was something strangely detached about his tone. He claimed that he had no choice but to defend himself, stating that he had acted in self-defense when Shamiya attacked him. His version of events seemed rehearsed, as if he had already constructed the narrative in his mind. When the police arrived, they found Shamiya lying lifeless on the floor with a gunshot wound to her head. The scene was chaotic. Brian was calm, too calm, giving conflicting accounts of what had happened. Some officers noted the strange lack of grief in his demeanor. There was no visible remorse, no emotional breakdown from a man who had just lost the mother of his child. Instead, he was focused on shifting the blame, repeating his claims of self-defense, painting Shamiya as the aggressor. The investigation into Shamiya's death quickly spiraled into a web of conflicting stories. Did Shamiya truly pull a gun on Brian, or had she been pushed so far by his emotional manipulation that she saw no other way out? Were Brian's claims of self-defense genuine, or had he orchestrated the situation to make himself appear as the victim? The police dug deeper, questioning Brian's behavior, especially his lack of emotion and his rapid attempts to control the narrative through social media. Shamiya's family was left to pick up the pieces, devastated by the loss of their beloved daughter, sister, and mother. Her mother, Danielle Pearson, was inconsolable, struggling with the painful reality that she could never save Shamiya from the man who had torn her apart. Her grief was raw, and every question that lingered about Shamiya's death only added to the unbearable pain. Danielle couldn't help but wonder if her daughter's death could have been avoided if only she had left sooner. If only someone had intervened before it was too late. The emotional weight of the situation was crushing. Shamiya had been a bright, hopeful young woman, full of life, and now she was gone, taken in the blink of an eye. As the investigation unfolded, the mystery surrounding her death deepened, and the questions surrounding Brian's role grew louder. Was it really self-defense, or had Shamiya been pushed too far by the man who claimed to love her? In the days that followed, as Brian continued to make his case, the reality of Shamiya's loss set in for her family. The tragic truth was that no matter how much they begged for answers, no matter how much they searched for justice, nothing could bring Shamiya back. The only thing they had left were the memories of a young woman who deserved so much more than the painful fate she met. In the days following Shamiya Allen's tragic death, Brian Jackson's behavior only deepened the suspicions surrounding him. While Shamiya's family was reeling from the loss of their beloved daughter and sister, Brian took to social media in a way that would raise more questions than answers. His reaction was cold, detached, and remarkably self-serving, starkly contrasting with the grief-stricken mourning of Shamiya's family. Rather than retreating into silence or showing any visible signs of grief, Brian made the decision to publicly control the narrative. On the day of Shamiya's death, he immediately posted on Facebook. His words were chillingly casual and devoid of the emotional anguish one would expect from a man who had just lost the mother of his child. "Whoever gave my baby mama a gun, she just broke into my house and was shot in the head," Brian wrote, as if his first priority was explaining the situation to his followers rather than processing the devastating loss. The public's response was swift and harsh. People took note of the coldness in his post, his lack of remorse, his lack of emotion, and they began to question everything. As the day went on, Brian's posts became more erratic. He went on to rant defensively, attempting to make himself the victim. In one post he wrote, "Man, forget all y'all for real, and that's on my dead baby. Yeah, I done went crazy and been doing dumb stuff." His words were riddled with contradictions and self-pity, offering little more than excuses for his behavior. The public saw this as an attempt to deflect responsibility, and the backlash was immediate. Followers began questioning why a man who had just experienced such a traumatic loss was so consumed with defending himself, instead of showing any genuine remorse for the woman he had lost. But what truly sent the public into a frenzy was a strange message that appeared on Shamiya's Facebook account just hours after her death. A lengthy post, written in a tone that seemed far too composed for someone who had just passed, apologized to Brian, saying that she regretted her decisions and that she had ruined everything by getting him locked up. The message made it seem as if Shamiya had written a final note before her death, absolving Brian of any wrongdoing. But something was off. The words felt too rehearsed, the structure too forced, and the tone far too detached for someone in distress. It didn't read like a suicide note. It read like a carefully crafted statement. Many began to wonder, had Brian written it himself, attempting to shift the blame onto Shamiya even in death? The suspicions only grew when Brian continued to post about the situation, obsessively defending himself and accusing the public of judging him unfairly. His actions were raising more eyebrows than ever, with many people questioning whether his story was true. He went from being a grieving partner to a man who seemed more focused on controlling the narrative than dealing with the tragic consequences of his actions. In stark contrast, Shamiya's family was left to grapple with the reality of their loss. Danielle Pearson, Shamiya's mother, spoke out publicly, expressing her devastation over the death of her daughter. She described Shamiya as a strong, vibrant young woman whose life had been cut short by someone who should have protected her, not manipulated her. Danielle's words were filled with raw emotion, as she mourned the loss of her child and tried to make sense of the senseless tragedy. There was no deflection in her grief, no attempt to manipulate the public. She simply wanted justice for her daughter and for the world to know the truth. As the investigation into Shamiya's death unfolded, the public began to question Brian's role in the tragedy more and more. The contradictions in his posts and the suspicious behavior only fueled the doubts about his version of events. Was it really self-defense, or had he pushed Shamiya to a point where she saw no other way out? Was the death truly a desperate act of self-preservation, or had Brian orchestrated it to cover his own guilt? The public wanted answers, but Brian's actions only made it seem like he was hiding something. The contrast between Brian's detached response and the family's genuine grief created an undeniable moral divide. The public was forced to ask, who truly held the moral high ground in this tragedy? Was it the grieving family, left with only questions and heartache, or was it Brian, whose callousness and manipulative behavior only heightened the suspicion surrounding his role in Shamiya's death? The investigation was still ongoing, but the more Brian spoke, the more he seemed to dig himself into a hole. His attempts to control the narrative only made him appear more guilty, leaving the audience questioning whether the truth would ever come to light. The loss of Shamiya Allen was felt deeply by her family, a devastating blow that left a hole no one could fill. As a daughter, sister, and mother, Shamiya's presence had been the glue that held her family together. Her mother, Danielle Pearson, was left struggling with the unbearable grief of losing her only daughter, the bright young woman she had raised with so much love. The weight of the loss was all-consuming. Danielle spoke through tears, reflecting on the dream she had for Shamiya, the hopes of watching her grow, achieve her goals and raise her son in a world full of possibilities. Instead, she was left with nothing but memories of a life stolen too soon. "It doesn't feel real," Danielle said, her voice choked with emotion. She was just a baby, she had so much to live for, and now I have to tell her son that he'll never see his mother again. That's the hardest part. I've lost my daughter, but my grandson, he's lost his mother. Shamiya's family struggled with the painful reality that nothing could bring her back. They couldn't undo the toxic relationship that had ultimately led to her death, nor could they reverse the manipulation and control that had isolated her from the people who truly cared. But despite their sorrow, they made it their mission to keep Shamiya's name alive and honor her memory. They were determined that her tragic story would not be forgotten, that it would serve as a warning to others. "We have to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else," said Shamiya's sister, tears streaming down her face. What happened to Shamiya wasn't just a tragedy. It was a wake-up call for all young women out there who think that love means putting up with this kind of abuse. We need to talk about these toxic relationships, the manipulation and the control. We can't stay silent. In the wake of Shamiya's death, the family spoke out, sharing their pain and their lessons learned. They urged young women to recognize the signs of manipulation and emotional abuse before it was too late. "Love is not supposed to make you feel small," Shamiya's mother added. "It's not supposed to break you down. Love should build you up, make you feel safe, not trapped." The family's words became a powerful call to action, not just for justice but for awareness, an urgent plea for others to see the warning signs of unhealthy relationships and take action before they spiraled out of control. Shamiya's death was not in vain. Her family's efforts to raise awareness about abusive relationships gave her story a purpose beyond the heartbreak. It was a reminder that love should never come at the cost of your freedom, your identity, or your well-being. And as they honored Shamiya's memory, they hoped to spare other young women from the same fate. If you found this documentary meaningful, please like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Sharing Shamiya's story could help raise awareness and save lives. Let's break the silence around toxic relationships, spread the message, and ensure that no one else has to suffer in the way she did. Thank you for watching, and remember to stay aware, stay safe, and always trust your instincts.